Joe Rogan leaned in across the studio table, his voice low but edged with that familiar mix of curiosity and challenge. "So tell me, Congresswoman, what real credentials do you actually bring to the table?" The words cut through the air sharper than any laugh line or podcast tangent. His smirk widened, as if he'd just placed a trap in the middle of the conversation. Waiting for her to stumble into it, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't fumble through talking points or scramble for validation. She simply sat back, eyes steady, shoulders relaxed, as if she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. The room froze. No one expected her evidence to flip the conversation upside down. Silence thickened as Rogan's listeners leaned in, headphones buzzing, live viewers glued to the stream. The pause was electric every second, stretching like the slow tick of a clock in a packed courtroom. Somewhere off camera, you could almost hear the sharp intake of breath, the stifled gasp of producers realizing this wasn't going to be just another interview. And then, with the calm precision of someone who knew the truth was heavier than any accusation, Crockett began to answer. Not with bluster, not with noise, but with receipt, undeniable, meticulous, impossible to spin facts that slice straight through the skepticism. The smirk on Rogan's face faltered. His eyebrows lifted just slightly, betraying the surprise he couldn't hide. The audience, usually quick to laugh or scoff, sat stunned. Murmurs rippled, disbelief giving way to something harder, sharper admiration. Because Crockett wasn't just defending herself, she was proving, right there in real time, that credentials aren't given by permission of the powerful. They're earned in the trenches, in battles most never see. Asterisk in that charged moment. It became clear that this wasn't just about a single question tossed across a podcast table. Joe Rogan wasn't merely asking about credentials, he was channeling a much larger current that runs through American discourse. He is, after all, the voice millions tune into for raw, unfiltered skepticism. His power lies not just in the questions he asks, but in the way he frames outsiders, challengers, disruptors, anyone who doesn't fit neatly into the establishment mold. Rogan represents the mainstream trial by fire where credibility isn't assumed, it's tested. And sitting across from him was Jasmine Crockett, the very embodiment of someone unwilling to bow under that test. She didn't carry herself like a guest waiting to be approved. She sat like someone who had nothing to prove, because her battles had already forged her legitimacy. Where Rogan leaned into the smirk of doubt, Crockett leaned into the calm of certainty. That clash of energies wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. Because the question burning beneath the surface wasn't about her resume. It was about something much bigger. Who gets to define legitimacy in America? Is it the gatekeepers, the commentators, the podcast kings who hold the microphones? Or is it the voices who've lived the struggle, fought the fights, and earned their scars in places the cameras rarely linger? The audience felt the stakes instinctively. They weren't just watching an exchange. They were witnessing a standoff between two forces. Rogan, the mainstream skeptic who embodies casual dismissal, someone who can wave a hand and raise an eyebrow to question someone's worth. And Crockett, the challenger who carried every unheard voice into that room, ready to refuse dismissal no matter how casually it was delivered. This wasn't just a conversation. What happened next would redefine the tone of the entire exchange. Because Crockett wasn't there to be weighed and measured. She was there to flip the scale, to remind everyone listening that legitimacy doesn't trickle down from powerful voices, rises up from lived experience. The microphones hummed. The room seemed to contract, all eyes waiting for what came next. The balance of the conversation had shifted, even if Rogan didn't yet realize it. What had started as a test of Crockett's credentials was fast becoming a test of Rogan's ability to handle the truth she carried with her. Asterisk, to understand the power of that moment. You have to understand Joe Rogan himself, the microphone, and the questions that cut sharper than a blade. Rogan didn't rise from the polished corridors of politics or academia. He carved his way through the rough-and-tumble world of stand-up comedy, where hecklers could end a career and survival meant sharpening your wit like a weapon. From there, he pivoted into the hyped spectacle of the UFC, his voice booming over roaring crowds, narrating chaos with a mix of humor, adrenaline, and authority. It was a strange path to cultural dominance, but it worked because it built him into the everyman with a microphone, the guy who could ask anything, challenge anyone, and say out loud what others were too cautious to utter. And then came the podcast. What started as a small experiment in freewheeling conversations grew into an empire. Millions tuned in, night after night, to hear Rogan probe, laugh, spar, and challenge. His aura was unmistakable, confident, curious, relentless, to his fans. He was the voice of common sense, the man who wouldn't let elites or experts lecture unchallenged. But that aura carried contradictions. Rogan wrapped himself in the banner of free speech, insisting that his platform was a place for open dialogue, a space where no topic was off limits. Yet critics accused him of something darker, using that very openness as a way to sow doubt, dismiss expertise, and amplify voices that thrived on undermining trust. He wasn't evil, not in the cartoonish sense, but he represented something just as potent, the skeptic who confuses credentials with control, the voice who believes that questioning everything automatically makes him the arbiter of truth. In his world, credentials weren't proof of dedication or expertise. They were red flags, symbols of establishment conformity to be knocked down and interrogated. That's why his question to Jasmine Crockett carried so much weight. It wasn't just a casual jab. It was Rogan doing what he does best, stripping authority figures of their armor and forcing them to justify their place at the table. But here's the twist. Crockett wasn't an authority figure wrapped in establishment armor. She wasn't walking in with the privilege of assumed legitimacy. She was walking in with lived experience, hard-earned knowledge, and a fire sharpened by battles Rogan had never fought. And that difference was the fault line. Rogan's story is one of relentless rise, of building a brand on skepticism and confidence. But in his skepticism lies a blind spot, the inability to see that sometimes the evidence doesn't wear a robe or a degree. Sometimes it wears the scars of survival, the determination of someone who refused to stay silent, the proof written in resilience. Asterisk, before the lights, before the microphones, before the moment that would leave Joe Rogan searching for words, there was a young girl growing up in a world that didn't hand out easy victories. Jasmine Crockett's story begins in working-class Texas, where the value of $1 was measured in sweat and sacrifice, and where a young black girl had to learn early that dignity wasn't given, it had to be demanded. Her family didn't come from political dynasties or boardroom wealth. They came from neighborhoods where resilience was a survival skill and where the law often felt like a weapon used against, rather than a shield for, communities of color. Jasmine saw injustice up close, neighbors fighting eviction, families struggling against systems stacked against them, kids told that their futures would never stretch beyond the limits of their zip code. These weren't statistics. They were the daily backdrop of her life. In Instead of letting that backdrop box her in, Crockett treated it like fuel. She studied relentlessly, carrying the weight of expectation on her shoulders, not just her own dreams, but the silent hopes of those who saw in her a chance for something more. She didn't just want to escape the struggles around her. She wanted to confront them head-on. That drive led her to law school, where she turned her sharp instincts into sharpened tools. She trained not simply to practice law, but to wield it to transform it into a voice for those so often silenced. When she became an attorney, Crockett didn't take the easy cases. She sought out the ones others avoided, the messy, uncomfortable fights that exposed corruption, exploitation, and injustice. She defended the vulnerable, challenged the powerful, and learned quickly that respect in the courtroom wasn't handed to her. As a young black woman, she faced skepticism at every turn. Was she experienced enough? Was she tough enough? Was she even legitimate? Each doubt wasn't just a question, it was a challenge hurled her way. And each time she met it with arguments so sharp they cut through pretense, with evidence so undeniable it forced even her critics to pause. Her tongue grew sharp because it had to. Her mind grew sharper because people kept trying to dull it. She wasn't just practicing law. She was preparing for every moment someone would try to dismiss her, minimize her, or question her place. And with each battle, she grew harder to shake. When Crockett stepped into politics, she carried that same energy with her. She didn't walk into the halls of power as a polished insider eager to fit in. She walked in with the outsiders, intimidated by the glares, never softened by the whispers. She understood that her very presence challenged the order of things. She was a black woman in spaces long dominated by men who looked nothing like her, speaking truths that made the powerful shift uncomfortably in their seats, and she refused to apologize for it. But Crockett's power isn't just defiance, it's empathy. She knows the sting of being dismissed because of race, gender, or class. She knows what it feels like to be underestimated before you've even spoken. That wet the collective. Dismissal of so many voices. Like hers is what she carries into every debate, every cross-examination, every public confrontation. When she speaks, it isn't just her voice, it's a chorus of all those told they weren't enough. All those who were cut off before they could finish their sentence. That's what makes her dangerous to someone like Rogan, because Rogan thrives on poking holes in authority, on finding the cracks where legitimacy crumbles. But Crockett's legitimacy isn't built on fragile titles, it's built on lived reality, on receipts she earned the hard way. She knows every scar, every slight, every dismissal can be turned into proof of survival, proof of credibility, proof that she belongs at the table, no matter how hard others try to push her away. So when she sat across from Rogan.com and unshaken, it wasn't confidence for show. It was the quiet readiness of someone who has spent a lifetime preparing for moments exactly like this. She wasn't just ready for Rogan's questions, she was armed with receipts. The air in the studio thickened as Rogan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, voice measured with the kind of skepticism that had cornered countless guests before. "Are you really qualified?" he asked, his tone laced with doubt. "What makes you different from the others who come here claiming to fight for justice?" His words hung in the air like a trap shot, baited, daring her to stumble. Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned in, her eyes steady, her voice carrying the kind of conviction that doesn't need to shout to be heard. "Qualified," she echoed, her tone slicing through the studio lights. "My qualifications are written in the lives I've defended, the systems I've challenged, and the communities that still stand because I fought for them. You want credentials? There, in every eviction notice, I overturned every young person I helped keep out of a prison pipeline designed for failure. Every voter I've defended when someone tried to silence their voice. The audience shifted in their seats, murmurs rippling as Crockett's cadence built momentum. Rogan raised an eyebrow, his trademark smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. But the edge of control was beginning to slip. He pressed again, voice probing. But passion isn't the same as expertise. Don't you think that her reply cut through like a blade? Passion without expertise is noise, but expertise without compassion. She let the pause linger, eyes sweeping across the room. That's dangerous. And that's what America has had too much of: people with power, with privilege, pretending that degrees or titles make them better judges of truth than the people living it every single day. The tension was electric now. Rogan tried to chuckle it off, but the chuckle didn't land. The audience wasn't laughing with him. They were leaning toward her. She could feel it, the shift in energy, the subtle tilt of the room in her direction. Crockett's voice rose, not in anger, but in a cadence that carried the weight of 1,000 unheard voices. You asked what makes me different, she said, her hand pressing firmly against the table. I'm different because I've lived what most people only debate. I'm different because I've walked into courtrooms where the odds were against me and walked out with victories that mattered, for people who had nothing else. I'm different because every time someone like you asks, "Are you really qualified?" I turn that question into a reminder that qualifications aren't always handed out by institutions. Sometimes they're forged in fire. The crowd exhaled, in a collective gasp, as if the words themselves had cracked something open. In that instant, Crockett wasn't just answering Rogan, she was answering every dismissal, every raised eyebrow, every doubt hurled at people who dared to claim space they weren't expected to occupy. Rogan shifted uncomfortably, eyes narrowing, searching for the next angle. But Crockett had seized the moment. Her words hung in the air, unshakable, undeniable. Rogan leaned forward again, his smirk returning as if to reclaim the ground he had just lost. Okay, he said, voice steady, but sharp. You've got passion, no doubt. But passion doesn't equal proof. Show me something tangible. What have you really done that proves you're more than just another politician with a rehearsed speech? The challenge landed like a hammer. The room seemed to shrink, the hum of the cameras and the faint shuffle of crew members amplifying the silence. Crockett didn't answer right away. She let the pause linger, her eyes steady, her hands resting calmly on the table. The silence stretched long enough for the audience to shift uncomfortably, glancing at one another. Rogan thought he had her cornered. Then she inhaled, slow and deliberate, and leaned in. Her voice dropped low, carrying a weight that silenced even the faintest whisper. You want proof? She asked. Here's proof. She pulled a folder from her bag, not thick, not flashy, just a few pages. She slid it across the table, toward Rogan. These are court documents, she said evenly. Cases where I fought and won against systems designed to crush people who looked like me. One case, a landlord trying to illegally evict single mothers, to flip their homes for profit. We stopped him. Another, a young man, barely 18, facing a lifetime in prison for a non-violent offense. I fought until the charges were reduced, until he had a second chance. He's now in college. That's not theory. That's not rhetoric. That's proof. The audience stilled. Rogan glanced down at the folder, then back up at her, his expression flickering. He hadn't expected her to come armed with receipts. But Crockett wasn't done. Her voice rose, not with volume, but with intensity. "And since you like numbers, Joe, let me give you some. Over 100 voter suppression cases. In my district alone, dozens of families saved from illegal foreclosures. Hundreds of people whose voices would have been silenced, if not for my team and me stepping in. This isn't about credentials you can hang on a wall. This is about lives." The words hung in the air. The silence after them was heavier than before, a silence thick with the recognition that something irreversible had just happened. Rogan opened his mouth, then closed it. His practiced confidence faltered, the smug curve of his lips flattening into uncertainty. He picked up the folder, leafing through the pages as if the papers themselves might dissolve under scrutiny. But they didn't. They were real, undeniable. The audience's reaction shifted in waves. First silence, then gasps as they caught sight of the documents, then a low swell of murmurs like the first rumble of a storm. Heads turned, eyebrows raised, whispers ricocheted through the room. Crockett sat back, calm and composed, watching Rogan wrestle with the evidence. She didn't gloat, she didn't smirk. She let the weight of truth do the work. For the first time, Rogan stumbled. His hand rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes flickering between the papers and Crockett. "Well," he muttered, the edge of bravado cracking. "That's something." Something. That was all he could muster. Crockett seized the opening. "You see, Joe, people like me get asked to prove ourselves every single day. We're told we're too loud, too different, too unqualified. But the truth, the proof is already in the work. We don't need permission to be credible. We just need the courage to show what we've done." The room erupted not with applause, but with that collective exhale of catharsis, the sound of people realizing they had just witnessed a moment they would replay in their minds and on their phones for days. It wasn't just about Crockett. It was about everyone who had ever been dismissed, doubted, diminished. She had stood up to the gatekeeper and turned the question back on him. And outside the studio, the ripples began instantly. Twitter lit up within minutes. She just fact-checked Rogan into silence. Receipts, actual receipts. Jasmine Crockett is the real deal. Memes sprouted, clips circulated, hashtags trended. Screens across the country replayed the moment. Rogan's composure cracked. It wasn't just a mic drop. It was a cultural echo, rebellion against every time credentials had been weaponized to dismiss lived experience. Crockett had not only answered the question, she had flipped the very premise upside down. But even as the studio buzzed with energy, even as the online storm brewed, one truth remained. This was only the beginning. The moment the cameras stopped rolling, the internet lit up like a fuse to dynamite. Clips of Crockett sliding the folder across the table were clipped, captioned, and blasted across every platform. By the time she left the studio, hashtags had already taken flight. Hashtag receipts, vs rhetoric, hashtag Crockett claps back, and the one that stung Rogan's defenders most, hashtag speechless Joe. Supporters flooded timelines with praise. She spoke the truth. She didn't flinch, didn't fold. One viral post read. That wasn't just a clapback. That was justice in real time. For millions who had been dismissed in their own workplaces, classrooms, or neighborhoods, Crockett's stand felt deeply personal. She had shown them what it looked like to push back and win. But critics came just as fast, rallying to Rogan's defense. They accused her of disrespecting the host, of grandstanding with her evidence. Some called her too aggressive. Others tried to downplay the documents she laid out. The divide was instant, fierce, and impossible to ignore. Late night. Comedians jumped on it within 24 hours. One joked, Joe Rogan wanted credentials. Jasmine Crockett handed him homework. Another quipped, when Rogan said, "Prove it," Crockett pulled out more paperwork than my tax guy. Laughter, applause, and viral clips of these jokes only added fuel to the cultural fire. Celebrities weighed in, to A-list actors, recording artists, and even a few athletes tweeted support. One actress wrote, "This is why representation matters." Crockett didn't just defend herself, she defended all of us who've been told to stay in our lane. Political commentators couldn't resist either. Progressive voices called it a turning point, proof that lived experience and hard evidence can shatter the gatekeeping of who's allowed to be taken seriously. Conservative commentators bristled, framing it as an ambush, an unfair attempt to humiliate Rogan. The clash of narratives only made the moment spread further, each side amplifying the clip to prove their point. But what mattered most wasn't the pundits or the celebrities. It was the ordinary people watching from their phones, their kitchens, their bus rides home. Comments poured in. She said what we've always wanted to say when people question our worth. Every time I get told I'm not qualified, I'm going to remember this moment. Crockett's evidence folder had become more than paper. Became a symbol. Proof that receipts matter more than rhetoric. Proof that truth doesn't bow to arrogance. A movement energy started to build, subtle but undeniable. Organizers referenced Crockett's takedown in speeches. Hashtags turned into threads, threads into essays, essays into calls for accountability in politics, in workplaces, in communities. Her words had left the studio, but her impact had entered the bloodstream of public discourse. For Rogan, it was an uncomfortable spotlight. For Crockett, it was validation but also responsibility, because as the noise roared and as the nation debated, one question hung in the air, larger than both of them, asterisk in the days that followed. The clash between Joe Rogan and Jasmine Crockett was no longer just about a single interview. It had become a referendum on something much larger. Who gets to decide what counts as legitimate in America? Was it the established voices, the ones with platforms and microphones, who defined truth by their skepticism? Or was it the people who carried lived experience, who had fought battles in courtrooms, neighborhoods, and communities, bringing receipts that no amount of dismissal could erase? Crockett's calm, deliberate counterattack had shifted the ground. Beneath that question, she had reminded the nation that credibility isn't granted by gatekeepers, it's earned through truth, through justice, through the willingness to stand firm even when every doubt is stacked against you. For years, Americans had seen credentials used as walls, degrees, titles, platforms wielded not as tools of service, but as weapons to silence. Crockett's refusal to bow showed another way. It wasn't about one fact, commentators began repeating. It was about refusing to let credentials be weaponized into silence. That sentiment rippled across conversations, embedding itself into dinner tables, classrooms, and online debates. People began to ask, how many voices have been ignored because they didn't fit the mold of qualified? How many truths dismissed simply because they came from those outside the mainstream's spotlight? This was more than a defense of one woman's legitimacy. It was a challenge to America's reflex to doubt those who don't arrive with the right endorsements stamped on their foreheads. Crockett's stand reminded the country of its democratic promise that power isn't concentrated in the hands of a few. but is carried in the voices of the many. There was something profoundly American about that moment. The daughter of working-class roots standing against one of the loudest cultural gatekeepers in the country. A reminder that dignity doesn't come from approval, it comes from persistence. That democracy is not about one voice controlling the conversation, but millions demanding to be heard. The moral lesson rang clear. Real credibility cannot be manufactured through influence or undermined by doubt. It is forged in the fire of lived struggle, in the courage to present truth even when someone smirks in your face. Rogan's smirk may have been confident, but Crockett's evidence carried weight. And in that clash, arrogance crumbled while dignity rose. It was a moment that validated so many watching. Immigrants told they didn't belong. Workers told their experience didn't matter. Women and people of color told their voices were too loud, too sharp, too angry. Crockett had taken their collective exhaustion and transformed it into a declaration. Your truth is enough. Your fight is enough. You are enough. The studio walls could barely contain the resonance of that message. Because in the end, it wasn't about one host, one guest, or even one podcast. It was about a battle that has echoed across generations. Who decides what counts? And who decides who counts? Asterisk, the headline moment still lingers. Joe Rogan, the man known for pressing, prodding, and never backing down, left in stunned silence. Across his face, the smirk faded, replaced by something re-empty. And across the room, Jasmine Crockett sat steady, armed not with bravado, but with undeniable truth. This wasn't just a clash of words. It was courage backed by evidence, dignity meeting doubt, truth standing taller than skepticism. And for millions watching, it was validation. The gatekeepers don't get the final word. Lived struggle, real receipts, and fearless voices can turn even the most confident interrogator into silence. That's why this story matters. Because it wasn't only about Rogan or Crockett, it was about the bigger fight to make sure truth cannot be dismissed, no matter who's sitting across the table. It was about every person who's been underestimated, every worker whose knowledge was brushed aside, every immigrant told they had to prove themselves twice as hard just to be heard. Crockett didn't just defend herself, she defended all of us, and now the torch passes to you. If you believe in amplifying voices like Jasmine's voices that cut through arrogance with evidence, voices that refuse to be silenced, then don't let this moment fade. Be part of the movement to make sure stories like this echo beyond one podcast. Join this channel, share this story, help amplify the truth that credentials alone don't define legitimacy, courage does.